If you followed every rule your parents taught you about budgeting and you still can't make it work, that is not a discipline problem, it is a math problem. The standard advice says to keep housing under 30% of your income. It says to save 20%. It says to build a 3-month emergency fund before doing anything else. That advice was written for a cost of living structure that no longer exists for most people in their 20s and 30s. Since 1985, the share of a typical renter's income going to housing has nearly doubled, from around 9% to nearly 17%. Student loan balances have added a fixed cost that entire previous generations never had to factor in, and entry-level salaries in most fields have not kept pace with any of it. So when a millennial runs a budget by the old ratios, the numbers do not just feel tight. They are structurally impossible before a single discretionary dollar is spent. This episode is about what to do with that reality. Not how to cut more aggressively inside a broken framework, but how to rebuild the framework itself around the ratios that actually describe your life today. The question this video answers is straightforward. If the old percentages no longer apply, what should your budget actually be built around instead? The fix is called ratio-first budgeting, and it starts by accepting what housing and essentials actually cost you today, not what a textbook says they should. Here is how it works. Instead of plugging your income into a preset formula, you flip the process. You measure your real fixed costs first, calculate what percentage of your take-home pay they consume, and then build every other spending category around what is genuinely left. If rent alone takes 45% of your income, no amount of discipline will make a budget designed for 30% rent feel livable. The math simply does not work. So ratio-first budgeting stops treating those gaps as personal failures and starts treating them as the actual numbers to plan around. Your savings target, your food budget, your discretionary spending, all of it gets sized to your real baseline, not an inherited one. It is a recalibration, not a compromise. The reason this approach actually works comes down to something behavioral economists call mental accounting. That is the tendency we all have to treat money differently depending on which mental bucket it lives in. When you build a budget around ratios that reflect your real life, your brain stops flagging every housing payment as a failure and starts treating it as the expected cost it actually is. There is also a loss aversion piece here. Traditional budgets, built on outdated benchmarks, constantly make you feel like you're losing. Spending 30% of income on rent when the old advice says 20 feels like a deficit, even when your overall finances are healthy. That repeated sense of falling short erodes motivation fast, and motivation is the engine that keeps any system running. When you recalibrate to accurate ratios, you remove the false loss signal. Your brain gets to experience something closer to neutral, or even progress. And neutral is genuinely enough to sustain behavior over time. You do not need to feel like you're winning every month. You just need to stop feeling like you are automatically losing before the month even starts. That shift from constant perceived deficit to realistic baseline is not a mindset trick. It is structural. You are changing what the budget measures, so the feedback it sends you is actually true. So here's where we stop diagnosing the problem and start building something that actually fits your life. The first thing you need is a clear picture of your fixed non-negotiables. These are the costs you cannot change this month no matter what. Rent or mortgage, loan minimums, insurance premiums, subscriptions you would face a fee to cancel. Write them down and add them up. That number is your floor. Step 2 is calculating your real take-home income. Not your salary, not your gross pay. The number that actually lands in your account each month after taxes and any automatic deductions. If your income varies, use the average of your last 3 months, then subtract 10% as a buffer. Now here is the part traditional budgets usually skip. Subtract your floor from your real take-home and look at what remains. For a lot of millennials, that gap is much smaller than the old advice assumed it would be. That is not a willpower problem. That is a ratio problem, and it changes everything about how you should allocate the rest. Step 3 is splitting that remaining amount into just 2 categories for now. Needs that are flexible, things like groceries and transportation, and everything else. Keep it that simple at first. So once you have your real numbers on the page, the next step is sorting them into 2 buckets. Costs you can influence this month, and costs that are locked in regardless of what you do. Fixed costs like rent, loan minimums, and insurance go into the locked bucket. Everything else, groceries, subscriptions, transportation choices, goes into the flexible bucket. Here is the single rule that makes or breaks this system. Never try to shrink the locked bucket through willpower. You can only shrink it through structural decisions. Moving, refinancing, renegotiating. Treating fixed costs like they are flexible is the #1 reason budgets collapse in the first week. Once you respect that boundary, the flexible bucket becomes workable. That is where your actual daily choices live, and that is where small adjustments compound into real progress over time. If you have been watching this series, episode 4 on the Pay Yourself First method connects directly here. That method works best when you apply it inside the flexible bucket only, after your locked costs are already accounted for. Stacking the two approaches is where most people find their first real traction. The goal is not a perfect budget. It is a budget built around your actual structure so that sticking to it requires less effort, not more. Here's a hypothetical example to make this concrete. Meet Jordan and Casey. Both earn $52,000 a year. Both try to follow the classic 50-30-20 rule. The difference is how they build their starting numbers. Jordan plugs in the textbook ratios. 50% for needs works out to about $2,600 a month. Rent alone runs $1,800. That leaves $800 for everything else in the needs category. And Jordan is constantly overspending before the month ends. Casey starts differently. Casey looks at actual housing costs first, finds that rent realistically takes 38% of take-home pay, and rebuilds the rest of the budget around that real number. Groceries, transport, and utilities get sized to fit what remains. The discretionary and savings categories shrink, but they exist and they hold. After 6 months, Jordan has made 3 budget resets and saved almost nothing. Casey has saved roughly $1,200, not because of higher income or lower rent, but because the budget started from today's actual cost ratios instead of a formula built for a different economy. The method Casey used is what we have been building toward this episode. Anchor to fixed reality first, then allocate what is genuinely left. Now, a few things trip people up when they try this approach, and all 3 are easy to fix once you see them coming. The first is calibrating your ratios with one good month instead of a real average. If you track spending during a quiet stretch with no car repair, no dentist visit, no travel, your baseline will look better than it actually is. Pull 3 to 6 months of data before you set anything in stone. The second is treating the housing ratio as fixed when it is actually the variable that drove you to rebuild the budget in the first place. Some people lock in their rent or mortgage costs and try to squeeze everything else. But if housing is already consuming 50% of your take-home, the ratio system cannot save you until you address that number directly, whether through income, location, or living arrangement. The third is recalibrating too often. Adjusting your ratios every few weeks because one category ran over is not fine-tuning. It is just a new way to avoid accountability. Set your ratios, run them for a full quarter, then review. Short-term variance is normal. The pattern over 90 days is the signal worth acting on. Avoid those 3, and the system does what it is supposed to do. It works with your actual life instead of an imaginary one. Now, a fair question at this point is whether any of this actually works if your income is tight, not just stretched, but genuinely limited month to month. The honest answer is that rebuilding your ratios around current costs helps regardless of income level, because the problem it solves is a framing problem, not a math problem. When you stop measuring yourself against a housing to income ratio from 30 years ago, you stop treating your rent as a personal failure and start treating it as a baseline to plan around. That shift matters even when the numbers are small. What it does not do is create money that is not there. If your income genuinely does not cover your fixed costs, no budgeting framework closes that gap on its own. In that situation, the budget becomes a diagnostic tool first. It shows you exactly where the shortfall lives, which makes it easier to target, whether that means finding a second income stream, adjusting a variable cost, or applying for assistance you may qualify for. The other real limitation is time. Rebuilding your budget around accurate ratios takes a few months to calibrate, because most people underestimate irregular expenses at first. Give it 2 to 3 full months before you judge whether it is working. The structure holds, but the numbers need time to reflect your actual life, not just your average month. So that is how this system fits into the bigger picture. In our zero-based and pay yourself first episodes, we worked with budgets built around a stable cost structure. This episode explains why that structure shifted and gives you a foundation that matches the numbers you are actually living with. Your one action for this week: pull up your last 3 months of housing and essential costs, divide that total by your take-home pay, and write down your real ratio. Do not compare it to the old rules. Just see what your number actually is. That single step will tell you more about why your budget has felt broken than any spreadsheet template ever could. Next episode in the Budgeting System series is called Flexible Percentage Budgeting, and it takes the ratio you just calculated and shows you exactly how to build a working budget around it. If this framing helps something click for you, subscribe so you get that episode the day it drops. Every video in this series builds on the last one, and the next step is where the real practical system comes together.